Hello, this is Gerard Perry, and today on Books, Music, and News Review, we're going to be discussing two books by the late author V.S. Naipaul, Among the Believers: An Islamic Journey, and Beyond Belief: Islamic Excursions Among the Converted People. And these two books were written approximately two decades apart. The first was actually published in 1981. The second was written in 1995 during a 6-month-long journey across 4 non-Arab Muslim nations: Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Iran, and was published in 1998. So they chronicle the evolution, particularly the evolution of Islam within these 4 nations. And they were written at a time, if you can take yourself back to the late 70s, early 80s, this was a time of huge revolt and internal dissension and conflict within the Muslim world. The Arabian world as well. You may remember the siege of Mecca, where a group of Salafists, one of whom believed that he was the Mahdi, the promised figure in Islam, who's going to come out from occultation during the end times. He claimed that he was the Mahdi and he had the right to take over Mecca. And this was the purported Mahdi. This is a figure that crops up throughout Islamic history. The most famous probably being the one in the Sudan who led a revolt against the English and was ultimately driven from power by Lord Kirchner. But this figure's cropped up throughout history, and in the late 70s, one of them, with a group of Salafi Muslims, including several Americans, took over Mecca, the Grand Mosque, the focal point of the city. They seized control and were driven out only many weeks later, after Saudi Arabia called in the help of French special forces units who used tow missiles and rocket-propelled grenades and heavy artillery to dislodge them. But the outcome of this was that the ruling Al Saud family, which had been ruling Saudi Arabia ever since the demise of the Ottoman Empire, they made an agreement with the clerics, the Islamic clerics, to impose a harsh Wahhabi version of Islam throughout Saudi Arabia. Not only that, but promoted throughout the world. So when you see mosques being built in the West or in Asia or Africa, when you see Sunni mosques being built, more often than not, they're being bankrolled by the Saudi government and the Wahhabis. And this alliance between Wahhab and Saud can be traced back all the way back to the 18th century. And it was something that was given much more potency once the West discovered oil underneath the Saudi Arabian desert. So this period launched so many, basically launched the jihadi, or reinvigorated the jihadi impulse among Muslims. And the Sunni Arabs were able to spread this throughout the world, and ultimately it led to groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Taliban. But this was an impulse that was also felt in non-Arab portions of the world that had succumbed to Islam. And V.S. Naipaul describes them as the converted people. So these were people who did not grow up in the environment of Arabia. And you have to understand that in Islam, you have, even though it purports to be a universal religion, it really is an Arab religion. And in fact, in the Quran, Muhammad repeatedly asserts the inerrancy and the uniqueness of the Quran, the fact that it was written in Arabic. And this is why in every single Muslim country, when someone goes to the mosque to pray and they hear the muezzin and they hear prayers, they hear them in Arabic. And upwards of three-quarters of the people in these mosques, if they haven't grown up in the Middle East, if they're not an Arab, they won't be able to understand what that person is saying, but they're taught to recite. Recitation is emphasized in the Quran, so they're taught to recite Arabic words that they don't understand the meaning of. So most of the Muslims in the world don't really have an understanding of their religion because it's being siphoned through an Arabic lens, and it just illustrates the fact that Islam itself is an Arabic religion. It's a particularist religion, and in order to be a Muslim, you have to basically shed all of your cultural attachments, all of your history and your heritage. And this is one of the main distinctions between Islam and Christianity, which really is a universal religion. It's a religion where Christ is offered, his salvation is offered to people, to the Jew and to the Gentile. In other words, to the entire world, for people who believe in him. It's not restricted to a certain region. And after Pentecost, after Jesus died and was resurrected and ascended to heaven, he gave basically marching orders to his disciples to go and spread this religion throughout the world, to evangelize and to tell people the gospel, to tell everyone the gospel, not just Jews, but Jews and Gentiles alike. So you can be a Christian and speak Korean or Tagalog or English or Spanish or Mandarin or Arabic, and you can be a Christian and you can still eat the foods that you were weaned on and retain the culture. Whereas in Islam, you have to adopt Islamic practices. You have to dress like a Muslim. You have to take a Muslim name. You essentially are absorbed into a foreign culture, and this is intrinsic to the religion, to the religion itself. So, a good illustration of this is in the first book, Among the Believers, where he's describing, he's making an analogy between the Spanish conquest of Mexico and Peru and the Arab conquest of the Near East. So after conquering the Arabian Peninsula, very shortly thereafter, Muhammad's companions and his successors sent their armies into Persia, as well as into the Levant. So he makes this analogy, and let me just read an excerpt here. There is this difference between the conquest of New Spain and the Chachnama. Bernal Diaz, the Spaniard, was writing of events he had taken part of. The Chachnama is Arab or Muslim genre writing, a pleasant story of conquest, and it was written 500 years after the conquest of Sind. The author was Persian. His source was an Arabic manuscript preserved by the family of the conqueror, bin Qasim. The intervening 5 centuries have added no extra moral or historical sense to the Persian narrative, no new wonder or compassion, no idea of what is cruel and what is not cruel, such as even Bernal Diaz, the Spanish soldier, possesses. To the Persian writing in 1216, the Arab conquest, the conquest of Khorasan, and this is something you might be familiar with because there's a jihadist group, the Khorasan group, which is an offshoot of ISIS, which is very active in Afghanistan and now in Syria. But it's a reference to that region of the world. Ajam, i.e. Persia, Iraq, Sham, which is Syria, Rum, Byzantium, and Hind are glorious. They are the story of the spread of true civilization. Conquest is pleasant to read about because conqueror is based on spiritual rectitude and temporal excellence, of which learned philosophers and generous kings would be proud, because all men attain advancement to perfection by acknowledging as true the belief of the people of Arabia. There is an irony in this praise of conquest. Not many years after these words were written, the invading Mongols were to arrive in Persia and Iraq, and the Arab civilization, which the Chachnama celebrated, was to be shattered, stupefied for centuries. Now, this is an interesting observation because when people in the West think of Persian civilization, they think of Ctesiphon, they think of Persepolis, which was the name of a famous series of memoirs by an Iranian writer, Marhani Satrapi. But they think of Cyrus the Great releasing Israel from captivity and allowing them to go back to their homeland and rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls. They think of King Darius, Artaxerxes. When you think of Persian culture and Persian heritage, almost everything you think of predates the arrival of the Islamic armies, which were able to succeed in destroying the Sasanian Empire because that empire was on its last legs after a protracted conflict with Rome and many wars with the Roman Empire. So they were able to destroy this empire, which was very, very enfeebled, and then take over. But ever since that time, the history of Persia, or what's now known as Iran, has essentially stopped. And you can look at this, you can see a parallel between this and the Islamic Revolution itself, which occurred shortly before V.S. Naipaul traveled to Iran. The fact that there was economic flourishing, there was an interest in the arts and culture, and kind of a cultural renaissance or revival happening in Iran under Shah Reza Pahlavi. And that immediately ceased once the Islamic Revolution occurred and once Ayatollah Khomeini and his minions were able to establish the idea of Vilayat-e-Fiqh, which is guardianship or jurisprudence. Fiqh is jurisprudence in the Islamic world. In other words, human interpretation of supposedly divine edicts, which are issued in the Hadith and in the Quran. So Iranian culture basically stopped. Once again, it was completely effaced by Islam and by the resurgence of Islam within this conquered territory. And this is something that is a recurring theme throughout the Islamic world, particularly in non-Arab cultures which are forced to assimilate to Arabic cultures. And you see this throughout throughout the Islamic world, and when Muslims are tasked with explaining why these countries are so retrograde, especially countries like Persia, which at one point were flourishing empires and the center of culture and the arts, the Muslim defenders of Islam will invariably say that this isn't real Islam, that Islam has not been practiced. And there's a great exchange in the second book, Beyond Belief, which highlights this tone deafness to what's actually occurring. So he has a conversation with a man named Salim in the context of Zia al-Haq, who was a Pakistani general who seized power, executed his predecessor, General Ali Bhutto, the father of the late Benazir Bhutto, who was killed by jihadists, and possibly the Pakistani government itself. He talks to this man Salim and asks him about this, about the fact that Pakistan and Iran have tried to implement Islam. So he says, still the father said Pakistan and Iran as countries were closest to the Islamic ideal that had to be given them. Salim agreed about Iran, saying that the only thing wrong with Iran was its quarrels with its neighbors. There was Sudan, too. That had to be considered as a country working towards Islam, but Salim wasn't sure about Sudan. Excuse me. I asked whether he wanted something like the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in Pakistan. Lying against the cushions, Salim said with some severity that a religious state had to encourage the good and deter the bad. All countries had police forces to do that. I said that this would be interfering with people's liberty. Salim said there was no free will in Islam. And this is true. The concept of free will is completely absent from Islam, which is a very deterministic religion. And his father, smooth-skinned and benign, said that the very word Islam meant obedience, submission. And this is true. I asked how the state would define what was Islamic. That had given General Zia a lot of trouble in spite of his Islamic Ideology Council. There would be debate, Salim said. He added, surprisingly, that everybody didn't have to agree. He, for example, didn't always agree with his father. His father, again, surprisingly said, there is freedom in Islam. What they wanted, the father said, was a state where everyone accepted Islam voluntarily with all his heart. And I began to understand how freedom and submission could run together. Salim said, Islam hasn't been tried. I was half expecting to hear this. I said, is vanity or pride wrong in Islam? Salim said yes. His eyes became uncertain, as liquid and melting as his son's. How can you cast this slur on all the millions who have gone before you? How can you say they have not been good? How can you make this claim for yourself? I had touched something. His father said, we can only be as good as we can be. So this is an interesting exchange for a number of reasons. It points out the contradictions within Islam, this idea that Muslims want people to accept Islam voluntarily, but there's an ingrained compulsion to coerce people who are not Muslims. And in fact, in the Quran, it tells you to forcibly compel people to accept Islam. And the only alternative to becoming a Muslim is paying a jizya, which is a levy or a tax. It's a tax levied on non-Muslim Christians and Jews, and in India, after the conquest of India, on Hindus, or face death and execution. And this is something that Islam hasn't reconciled itself to the notion that people have free will and they're free to choose. And this is why Muslim apostates have to live for fear of their lives. And even in Western countries, they're attacked and beaten if they live within Muslim communities. And there are a number of interesting aspects of these two books. Of course, they're separated by 2 decades, but he charts the gradual evolution and the what some people would call the radicalization of Muslims within these nations. But I would describe it more as Muslims having greater access, particularly after the mid-90s, to Islamic texts in their language, so they can actually understand the meaning of the Quran, the meaning of the Hadith. These are things that were barred to them, that they would only hear portions of in a completely foreign language. But now that they can read them for themselves in their own language, they're faced with a few alternatives. And the late Naipaul Qureshi described this perfectly in his book Answering Jihad. He said, now that you're confronted by these texts and you can understand them in your own language, if you're a Muslim, you're faced with three alternatives. Ambivalence, just ignore what you've discovered, or you could go deeper and deeper into Islam and say, well, if this is what Islam is like, then I have to accept it and I have to become a jihadist. Or the third alternative, which is the one that Naipaul Qureshi took, was to become an apostate, to say that you can't reconcile yourself to the true nature of Islam. And this was something that happened to Naipaul when he started to read the Hadith for himself. Instead of simply going to a mosque and listening and being able to recite prayers in a foreign language, he read what Muhammad was truly like, and he realized that even an authentic Hadith like Sahih Muslim or Sahih Bukhari, that these authenticated Hadith attested to the very corrupt, evil nature of Muhammad and his actions, and the fact that he wasn't a genuine prophet. So this is something that V.S. Naipaul tracks, particularly in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. Now, in the first book, Among the Believers in Islamic Journey, he describes how some people in Indonesia are calling Islam the Malaysian disease. So because this was part of a chain of islands, an archipelago, ruled by the Dutch, but also in Malaysia, the Malaysian part ruled by the English, you have a European colonial influence competing with the colonial Muslim influence. Now, Muslims like to cite Indonesia as an example of the beauty of Islam because it's one of the only parts of the Islamic world that did not come into the Ummah by virtue of military means. It wasn't invaded, it wasn't conquered militarily. Rather, it was something that was adopted by wealthy merchants and certain rulers who took it was Islam cajoling very powerful people to become Muslim. So it didn't involve brutal conquest like Hindustan, i.e. India, or Jerusalem, or the Arabian Peninsula itself, the way that Muhammad slaughtered and expelled Jewish tribes like the Banu Qurayza and the Banu Nadir. But the truth is that Islam itself, even though you can point to this one example of Islam coming about through non-military or non-coercive means, it's simply the exception that demonstrates the rule, that people weren't willing to accept Islam, and that the reason Islam succeeded in a large part of the world was through coercion. And one of the ironies is that when he comes back to Indonesia and Beyond Belief and Malaysia, he does find increasing radicalization. In the first book, he pointed to Imaduddin, who was a fiery Islamic preacher forced to flee Indonesia after criticizing the ruler Suharto. And he's back, and he's become an integral part of Suharto's government as he became more and more Islamic in order to sway favor with the people. And of course, Suharto's government ultimately fell after many decades in power. He was replaced by someone else profiled in the book, Habibie. Indonesians are famous for having one name they're associated with. and Habibi was Suharto's underling. But these men who were like Imaduddin, who were dissidents and radicals, gradually became integrated as the Muslim rulers, the ostensibly Muslim but secular rulers, realized they needed to curry favor with Muslims in order to retain power. So he finds this increasing expression of Islam in Indonesia and Malaysia, but he also finds a growth in Christian believers and lots of converts, not only from indigenous tribes. So a lot of the growth in Christianity in Indonesia took place during the colonial period among indigenous non-Malays in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and non-Indonesians, native tribesmen. But he finds when he comes back, there are a lot of former Muslims that became Christian, and it's not a huge part of the book. There are only fleeting references to it. But I think it's interesting because the second book was written in 1995, and it serves as a precursor to what's actually happened in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. You have large-scale revival movements. You have a lot of people who are abandoning Islam. And in fact, there was even a book recently published which chronicled all of the revival movements among Muslims in Muslim nations like Indonesia and Malaysia, Algeria. And these are happening where thousands and thousands of people are deciding to follow Christ and abandon Islam and abandon Muhammad. And before the late 20th century and the early 21st century, these were vanishingly rare. These were things that happened maybe once or twice over the course of centuries. But now you have dozens of them cropping up all over the place. So I think V.S. Naipaul was able to choose very carefully and very astutely what he would profile. The idea of Pakistan and the internal dysfunction of Pakistan is chronicled brilliantly in these two books. So the nation of Pakistan then, which was ruled by a general, is still under the control of the ISI and the military, but the roots of Islamic jihadism have only sunk deeper and deeper, and the country has become only more dysfunctional, highlighted by the election of a Pakistani cricketer who lived in England for years and was a playboy, but is now an Islamic fanatic trying to appeal to English-speaking, anti-American, anti-Western Pakistanis. And he essentially was chosen to be president by the ISI and the Pakistani military and the people who actually run that country. So he chose these countries very particularly and very well, because even all these years later, despite them not being in the complete turmoil they were at the end of the 1970s and beginning of 1980s, they are still the focus of so much attention and so much interest because of all of these conflicting movements. The movement for freedom, or Azad in Iran, the movement, the growing revivals in Muslim countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, where the newfound faith of Islam is deteriorating and eroding very rapidly. And V.S. Naipaul is able to look at these things from the distant vantage point of an observer, someone who was born in Trinidad to Indian parents and lived in England.
30 seconds.
And he's able to take the view of a neutral observer and really analyze these trends and these cultures brilliantly. So that was my review of Beyond Belief and Among the Believers. And I would definitely recommend checking out these books if you have the opportunity.